You are now listening to 1-900 Old Ladies, The Lost Art of Making Lefse, written by Ellie Starr, narrated by the author. Post-production by Pinto Media. Chapter 4. The skin will break when they're just right. You drain all the water out and let them cool. Then you peel them. The skin comes off real easy, and you can peel them pretty fast. Sometimes you can just rip the skin right off with your bare hands. Sigrid Sievertson. Ellen Sievertson Peters stood at her kitchen sink and peeled a pot of boiled and cold potatoes. She had just hung up the phone from a conversation with her sister who lived in Wauchula, Florida. Ellie had hoped that Margie might have some extra cash to share with her, which might help her make it through the winter. As a last resort, she reluctantly called Margie after her husband had left her destitute over 2 weeks ago. Unfortunately, Margie was not in a position to help Ellie with her financial woes. All her cash was tied up in an investment annuity that her husband had purchased. This had depleted their life savings. Ellie worried about her overdue bills, which needed to be paid. Her monthly teacher's pension would not arrive until the 1st of November. As Ellie stood at the sink, she peeled potatoes with her bare hands. She considered her relationship with Stanley. They had been married almost 27 years, during which time she and their young son had endured so much abuse, it was harrowing for her to even recount. Stan Jr. resembled Stanley in some ways, but never in attitude or demeanor. Both men had piercing blue eyes and a pointed nose with a narrow bridge. Stanley had a son by his previous marriage, named Robert, who had been killed in Vietnam shortly before he and Ellen married. Several months later, Ellen gave birth to her son. Stanley insisted on naming him Stanley Jr., which Ellie reluctantly agreed to. She resolved to avoid confusion by referring to her husband as Stanley or Stan Sr. She always referred to her young son as Stanley Jr. or Stan. When she was asked by a stranger how to keep the two names straight, she would offer up her simple mnemonic. Stanley was a big man. He got the longer version of the name. Stan was an abbreviated version of his father, so he was given the abbreviated version of his father's name. To Ellie, the simple act of naming a son after his father was not so much a sign of respect as it was a recipe for disaster. If Stanley had not been so insistent upon naming his son after him, she would have chosen any other name. It was always a difficult thing to explain who was who when referring to either her husband or her son. But the greater difficulty of naming a son after his father lay with a son's early perceptions that he should model after his namesake. If his father was a good man, or if the son idolized his father, he may have inadvertently set the bar too high. A son's goals of emulating his father might be virtually unattainable. Conversely, if a boy's namesake had the reputation of Ellen's husband, Stanley, the poor child might be forever cursed. Such was the plight of Stan Jr. Stanley's abuse of Ellen was mostly psychological, but he did strike Stan Jr. often as a young boy. Like Ellie, Jr.'s demeanor and personality was very reserved and quiet, and he generally learned how to avoid standing in Stanley's crosshairs early on. Although Ellen tried to set a good example for her son by not speaking a cross or unkind word against her husband, Jr. soon realized how despicable his father actually was. Ellen recalled several occasions where Stanley Sr. raised his cane against Stanley Jr. if he somehow managed to commit some unforgivable offense to enrage him. Usually, the offense was something inconsequential, which shouldn't have provoked a conscientious and loving father to ire. But Stanley needed very little provocation to set him off. When Ellie's husband disciplined her son, he was unmerciful, and he usually used his cane to aid him in these unwarranted beatings. In private, Ellen would often sob to herself, sympathizing for her young son. who was such a sensitive and caring boy. He was nothing like Stanley Sr. He was a very good boy. One particular day, when Stanley Jr. was about 16, Ellen's husband became infuriated about some infraction that her son had allegedly committed. She couldn't remember what he actually did. Maybe he disturbed one of Stanley's precious tools. Who knows? Ellen recalled standing at the kitchen window, watching this exchange as her son and husband stood out in the front yard. At 16, Stanley Jr. had grown 2 inches taller than his father. By this time, Stanley Sr. had become obese and out of shape, and Jr. had decided that he had finally endured enough abuse. As Stanley Sr. once again raised his cane against his son, Stanley Jr. stopped him, grabbing the cane from his father. Jr. then raised the cane to threaten Stanley Sr. "I am going to tell you this once. I have had it with this shit. If you ever, I mean ever, raise this cane to anybody, including Mom, I will lay you out and not think twice about it, old man. Don't you ever strike me again." From that point on, Stanley Sr. never threatened his son again. Stanley Jr. turned 18 in 1983. The day after he graduated from high school, he moved out. Ellen was inconsolable. Her only son, her life, was walking out on her. In reality, he wasn't walking out on his mother at all. It was his father he was leaving. He couldn't bear to witness any more of the repeated abuses his father had piled onto his poor mother during the course of his short life. He had simply had enough. "What will I do without you, son?" Ellie sobbed. "I will be all by myself up here." "Mom, I know you stayed with Dad for my sake. You need to retire from teaching and leave here. Move out. Dad doesn't need you." He held his mother's sobbing face in his hands and gazed into her tear-filled eyes. "When I get settled, I will send for you. You can come live with me." He moved to Tucson, where he attended vocational school and studied air conditioning and refrigeration, a very marketable trade for someone sweltering in the Arizona heat. After he graduated in 1986 and found his first job, Stanley Jr. had finally extended his invitation for Ellie to come live with him. Each time she declined, believing that Stanley Sr. still needed her. Part of her also believed that she was destined to die on the farm. This was where she was born. This was where she had lived her entire life. This was her farm. When Stanley Sr. married Ellie in 1965, he received it as a dowry from Ellie, who had inherited the farm from father. This was originally the Sievertson farm. This farm was in her blood. Also, Ellen felt that if she did move to Tucson, she would only prove to be a burden to her son. He had endured so much with Stanley Sr. during his childhood. He deserved to start a fresh new life for himself. He needed to raise his own family, pursue happiness, and leave his troubled past behind. Having Ellie around would only serve to remind him of his miserable childhood and having to grow up around his cantankerous father. After extending countless invitations to his mother to move to Tucson, Stanley Jr. finally met and married his wife, a Hispanic woman named Rosa Ramirez. 5 years earlier, when Ellen had retired, she had seriously considered moving there. But she would definitely feel like an intruder if she tried to live with her son and his new wife. By that time, Junior stopped nagging Ellie to come live with him. But after Rosa came to visit 2 years ago, she assumed the responsibility of encouraging Ellen to move in with them. Rosa's inscription on the back of the photograph was meant for her mother-in-law and not for Stanley Sr. Ellen knew that Rosa didn't like Stanley Sr. at all and would never ask him to come live with her. During the short 2 days that she and Stan Jr. spent at the farm 2 years ago, Rosa had soon learned to despise the man. It was almost impossible for her and her hot Latin temper to conceal her utter disdain and repulsion for Stanley Sr. But because she was so in love with her husband, she bit her lip and kept these feelings to herself. Stanley Sr. was oblivious to Rosa's contempt for him. He believed she extended the invitation to come live in Arizona to him as well as to Ellen. Even if he suspected that Rosa despised him, which he didn't suspect at all, he really wouldn't have cared. She was merely a woman, and a woman's opinion should never be regarded as anything important. Ellen peeled each potato by pulling back the skin and applying pressure with her thumb and index finger. Peeling potatoes always works well after you boil them, she thought to herself. Grandmother Severson was right. She considered the predicament in which her husband had left her, and she imagined each potato to be a shrunken Stanley head. She envisioned each eye of the potato as Stanley's eyes, puncturing them with her thumbnail and savagely digging them out. She pretended to peel the skin off his face and imagined herself stripping Stanley of his spiteful grin. When the potatoes were peeled, Ellen washed them in the sink and started to quarter them. She placed each potato on her cutting board and hacked at them with her knife. They were soft, and they really didn't require much pressure in order to cut. But Ellen found this process somewhat therapeutic. She wasn't really cutting them. Essentially, she envisioned herself slashing little Stanley heads. She raised her knife above her head in order to gain a more forceful and violent momentum. As she chopped the potatoes, she repeated the instructions of her current task in her head. Peel and quarter, peel and quarter. I'd like to peel the skin off his miserable face. Quarters. He hasn't left me a dime, much less a miserable quarter. Ellie dropped her knife as she suddenly remembered the Susan B. Anthony dollars her husband hoarded. They were still hidden somewhere around the house. Where did he hide them? That's right, under the kitchen floorboards. Over the course of the last 13 years, Ellie's husband Stanley had accumulated as many Susan B. Anthony dollars as he could lay his hands on. The dollars were minted primarily in 1979, but they were not very popular. A few were minted in 1980 and 1981 for collectors, but they were disliked as currency by the average shopkeeper because they were too easily confused with quarters. The dollar itself was 11-sided, but its size was significantly smaller than the silver dollars minted previously in the U.S. Stanley's fascination with collecting the dollars was not in the historic significance of Susan B. Anthony. He hated all women, especially the women's livers. What he enjoyed about the Susan B. Anthony dollars was that he could torment local shopkeepers by handing them a quarter-sized coin, which they would be forced to accept as dollar currency. Most cash registers didn't have an extra compartment for the coin, which made accepting it especially problematic. Most vending machines would not accept the currency at all. When the U.S. Mint discontinued the Susan B. Anthony dollar, Stanley decided to start hoarding any that he could find. He was sure that they would become a collector's item now that they had been discontinued. Therefore, he surmised that it wouldn't be long before they appreciated in value. As a result, he made periodic trips to the state bank and asked them to sell him any coins they had available. Although he hid the coins in places he didn't think Ellie would discover, the situation was much like his Folgers coffee can stash in the barn. Ellie knew exactly where he kept his cash, but she never let on. Stanley, believing himself to be particularly skillful at concealing things from Ellie, had no clue that she knew exactly where he hid almost everything. But Stanley was not particularly intelligent. In fact, his intelligence quotient showed that he was mildly retarded and could have been officially classified 20 years back as a moron. But because he was so self-centered and sociopathic, he failed to ever notice that almost everyone around him was far more intelligent than he. When Ellen recalled the Susan B. Anthony dollars and how stupidly paranoid her husband was, she suddenly remembered the episode in the front yard where Stanley Sr. threatened Stanley Jr. Before hiding his coins under the kitchen floorboards, Stanley hid his bags of coins under the floorboard of his rusty pickup truck. Stanley Jr. had just learned to drive, and he would often take the truck out on errands. Stanley Sr. never maintained any of his vehicles. They were often used, rusty, and dilapidated. She recalled one particular time when the passenger's side door latch of his truck was broken. Rather than repair it, he chose to tie the door shut with a bungee cord. Ellen almost fell out of the moving vehicle when Stanley Sr. took a sharp left turn and the cord snapped loose. Stanley's failure to maintain his vehicle, or the farm for that matter, stemmed from the fact that he preferred to spend his money buying liquor. On the rare occasions when he was sober, he attended local auctions in order to acquire more things to hoard. He never spent money to maintain his deteriorating vehicles or anything else the family needed. If his vehicles got him from point A to point B, that was all he really cared about. That was the case with his old Chevy pickup truck, which his son used on occasion. One day, Stanley Sr. accused Stanley Jr. of stealing the Susan B. Anthony dollars from a stash he had hidden in the floorboard of his old truck. Ellen suddenly remembered the cause of their last blowout in the front yard. That was the day that he threatened to strike his son with his cane for the very last time. That was the day that his son threatened him in turn, after which Stanley Sr. retreated. It was all because of those gosh darn dollars, she thought to herself. How ridiculous. As it turned out, the floorboards of Stanley Sr.'s beat-up old pickup had rusted through due to years of neglect and abuse. The result was that his prized stash had slowly fallen through the hole of the rusty floorboard, one by one, until every last coin had dropped onto the street, driveway, or anywhere else Stanley had traveled. When Stanley Sr. had discovered what had actually happened, that his coin collection had simply fallen through the rusty floorboards, he never apologized to his son for his wrongful accusations. But he did relocate his stash to the kitchen floorboards to prevent such an incident from ever recurring. Ellen grabbed the Phillips head screwdriver, which her husband had left sitting on the kitchen table. She was going to find those dollars if she had to peel up every floorboard in the kitchen. She retrieved a heavy meat mallet from the kitchen drawer. Then, board by board, she hammered the screwdriver tip into the wooden seams with the meat mallet until she could pry up the floorboard. Ellen didn't possess a great deal of upper arm strength, but she mustered up almost a superhuman strength, motivated mostly by hunger and cold. She was going to find those coins if it killed her. She systematically peeled up each board, hoping to find the bag of coins she knew Stanley had hidden. She ripped up each board and peered underneath. But each time she peeled up a board, she found nothing except a few cobwebs, bug carcasses, or dust bunnies. After prying up about 20 boards, Ellie became discouraged. She dropped her meat mallet and screwdriver. She sat on the floor, discouraged, and almost in tears. Exasperated, she gazed to the right of her foot, just under one of the legs of the small kitchen dinette. There she noticed a board, significantly more worn than the other boards of the floor, and it looked to her like this board had been peeled up and sloppily nailed back in place. She picked up her makeshift hammer and screwdriver and chiseled at the seam of the board. When she could sufficiently reach her screwdriver underneath the board, she tried to bend it back and peer under it. There, in a well-worn burlap bag, lay Stanley's coin collection. Ellie reached her bony fingers under the board and grasped for the bag. After some finagling and wiggling, she finally retrieved the bag from beneath its subfloor hiding place. Now ecstatic, she poured the bag's contents out on the kitchen floor, counting each coin. For heaven's sake! There were exactly 73 Susan B. Anthony dollars in the bag. They would be worth $73 at least, and that was enough to buy some groceries, flour, coffee, meat, eggs, and more potatoes. That would get her by for a few weeks anyway, carrying her through October until she received her modest pension check at the beginning of next month. Yes, Ellie thought to herself, that might just be enough. Thank you, Stanley. Thanks for being such an obsessive hoarder. The Serene Waters RV and Trailer Park in Wauchula, Florida, consisted of about 25 single-wide mobile homes crowded onto a 5-acre plot of land. At least, the park managers claimed it was 5 acres. The way the homes seemed to be piled on top of one another, Margie and John were really not sure. Each home was uncomfortably close to the next, and one's excruciatingly small yard was never really considered private. It was more of a community yard. It was not uncommon for John and Margie to walk out their front door and trip over some neighbor kid's big wheel, tricycle, Barbie doll, or action figure. There would often be discarded beer bottles and cans in the yard, left there by residents who found it more convenient to just drop them there than to drop them in an actual garbage can. Sometimes they would trip over live kids whose mother was cooped up in her trailer, probably watching Jerry Springer and completely oblivious to their child's current whereabouts. Margie and John Carter were now 60 and 62 respectively. They were officially senior citizens. They could have easily found a cozy trailer in a quiet retirement park, but neither Margie nor John considered themselves old, and the idea of being surrounded by LOLs, little old ladies, and crotchety old men who had nothing better to do than to stick their wrinkled noses into their neighbors' affairs cramped their free and easy lifestyle. They were technically old, but they felt young. They still liked to go out for nights in the town, late-night drinking, and an ever-occasional romp in the bedroom. So instead, they chose to live in Serene Waters. The ironic thing about the name Serene Waters was that Hardee County was located in the dead center of the state of Florida. It was at least an hour's drive to the Gulf beaches. In fact, there was no body of water located anywhere in or near the park, except for the occasional puddle left behind by the typical summer afternoon deluge. Neither was the park serene. It was typically noisy at all hours of the day and night. The younger residents of the park kept their music, usually country and western, blaring loudly at all hours. Nagging wives could often be heard ridiculing their poor henpecked husbands. Mothers slapped and spanked their children within earshot of their neighbors without fear of being reported to Child Protective Services. And children could constantly be heard yelling and screaming, even at 3 a.m., long after children with good and respectable parents would have sent their little tykes to bed. This failure on the part of management to enforce any sort of noise ordinance in the park worked to Margie's advantage. This was mainly due to the fact that, on the rare occasion that she and her husband did have a romp in the boudoir, Margie had a tendency to be very vocal. Her groans, grunts, and screams of ecstasy, as well as a few expletives, could easily be heard throughout the trailer park and several blocks beyond that. Simply stated, when Margie had sex, she was extremely loud. John had been married to Margie for over 40 years and was used to the noise. That was one of the qualities that attracted him to her lack of sexual inhibition. That was in addition to her beauty and her very sexy and youthful voice. It was true that Margie had gained a few pounds over the years, but her voice was still as sexy as ever, and John found it stimulating to hear her openly discuss sex. It really turned him on to hear her scream in ecstasy during the act of coitus. Sometimes he would simply beg her to talk dirty to him for his own personal amusement, no strings attached. During the time they spent as a young family, Marge's children learned early on to tune out their mother's heated cries of passion, which usually originated from behind the closed bedroom door. They developed a thick skin. Like their mother, they talked about sex and human sexuality openly. When they were young, Margie and John would have intercourse 2 or 3 times a day. As John grew older and his sex drive diminished, Their encounters became less frequent. Now that he was a senior citizen and his health was failing, Margie was happy to get it once a month. But what the neighbors at Serene Waters Trailer Park discovered was that the less frequently Margie Carter got sex, the louder she got when she finally did get it. Often, following one of Margie and John's now rare encounters in the bedroom of their cramped trailer house, a few embarrassed parents living in the park would be required to prematurely educate their curious child about the specifics of the birds and the bees. Needless to say, if Margie's cries of passion were loud enough to embarrass residents of the Serene Waters RV and trailer park, she had to be pretty damn loud. One particular afternoon, John Carter was feeling unusually amorous after his wife had a brief phone conversation with her sister Ellen in North Dakota. They tiptoed to the bedroom hand in hand, shut the door, and stripped down to their naked bodies. As Margie started to warm up, her groans of pleasure could be heard throughout the park. "Oh, God. John, honey. Oh, yeah, do me. Oh, baby. I'm so hot for you right now. Ooh, yeah, that's it. Do it to me, you bad man. Mmm. Mmm. Oh." As Margie and John engaged in intercourse, the headboard of the bed was rhythmically knocked against the paneling of the bedroom wall, causing the entire trailer to shake. As the knocking and shaking of the trailer became more and more frequent, so too did Margie's simultaneously timed oohs and ahs. She let out one final and resounding scream as the noise and the shaking ground to a halt. Margie's cries of pleasure were followed by a long silence and subsequent cries of terror. Her husband had suffered a heart attack during their episode of heated lovemaking. In a panic, she called 911. She was scantily clothed when the EMTs finally arrived at her trailer. They pushed their way past concerned neighbors, and she let them in. John lay on the gurney. He was still conscious, but sweating profusely and short of breath. He grasped his left arm and chest in excruciating pain. The EMT strapped oxygen around his face while he tried to tell Margie he wanted her to put some pants on him before they carted him outside. As the EMTs lifted John's gurney into the back of the ambulance, Margie, dressed only in a sexy silk robe and black lace teddy, jumped in the back with him. The ambulance driver closed the doors. Terrified, Margie held her husband's hand as she scolded him. "Don't you dare die on me, John Carter, or I will hunt you down in hell, you son of a bitch."